They said the chambers where the Maid of Kent first collapsed smelled of incense and beeswax, that the air itself felt heavy with prayer. But no cloud of perfume could ever hide what was really happening inside those walls. Because while everyone else whispered of miracles and visions and holy messages from heaven, the young woman at the center of it all already knew she was walking straight towards something far worse than death. And the first step of that journey did not begin on the day she fainted before a relic. It began the day a boy named Henry opened his eyes in a kingdom that had already decided to worship him. In the year 1491, when Henry Tudor's second son came screaming into the world, England was still limping out of the wars that had shredded it. The fields and manors and city streets haunted by memory of rebellion, pretenders, and broken oaths. And nobody looking at that red-faced baby could have guessed that one day a nun in a quiet Kentish cloister would die because of him. But the court around his cradle wasted no time, turning a child into an omen. A promise. A vessel for every terrified hope of the fragile Tudor line. So, from the very beginning, Henry was not raised as a boy who might fail. He was raised as a prince who could not be wrong. At Eltham Palace, and the other glittering houses where he grew up, tutors and priests wrapped him in Latin phrases and theological arguments. They placed books in his hands and praised his quick mind. They trained his body for hunting and war. But with every lesson they also repeated the same poison dressed up as holiness. That he was the Lord's anointed. That his will was not just powerful, but sacred. That when he spoke, it was as though God himself had given judgment. And while they knelt to pour his wine and bowed to avoid turning their backs, a hard conviction settled in his bones. The belief that love was something you commanded, not something you earned. That obedience was the only loyalty that mattered. And that compassion could be dangerous because it suggested he might have limits. His grandmother, Margaret Beaufort, the iron backbone of the Tudor dream, reinforced that message with every careful word and every story she chose to tell. Because she had lived through exile and danger, through nights when it was not clear whether her son, Henry VII, would ever wear a crown. And she passed all that fear straight into her grandson's soul, teaching him that the world wanted to take his power away, that any hesitation could invite ruin. And that survival meant gripping every rope of authority with both hands and never letting go. So when the crown finally touched his head in his late 20s, he did not feel it as a weight to carry. He felt it as armor, as confirmation that everything he had been told was true, that England was his body, and its people were his veins, and every church bell that rang did so because he allowed it. For a while, the story still looked like a golden one. The sort that foreign ambassadors would write about with envy. The handsome young king who loved music and feasts and tournaments, who rode out in shining armor beneath fluttering banners, who wanted glory in France and admiration from Rome. Yet even in those early years there were cracks beneath the glitter, flashes of temper when advisors dared to say no. A restless hunger for control when the rules of the old church got in the way of his desires. And when his first marriage failed to produce the living son he wanted, that hunger pressed harder and harder against the boundaries that had held every English king before him, until finally he decided that if the Pope would not move for him, then he would move the entire religious world instead. The break with Rome did not fall out of a clear blue sky. It built like a storm, gathering weight in legal arguments and secret consultations, until the day Henry declared that no man in Italy would stand between him and his own conscience. And in practice that meant no man in Italy would stand between him and Anne Boleyn. So with acts of parliament and proclamations, he carved himself a new title, Supreme Head of the Church of England. A phrase that wrapped personal obsession in holy language and turned centuries of tradition into a pile of rubble. And as monasteries were stripped of their gold, as abbots were pushed from their seats, as monks scattered like frightened birds. Henry's followers called it reform, while others whispered the word desecration. But either way, the message was the same: that altars and laws and oaths would bend to his will or break under it. Into that charged, trembling landscape, where every sermon might be treason and every prayer might be tested, the figure of Elizabeth Barton appeared almost like a ghost stepping out of the mist. Though she was no ghost, only a young woman, barely past girlhood, who had once been an ordinary servant in Kent, before illness seized her body and strange trances seized her voice, and when she fell into visions before a statue of the Virgin, speaking words that seemed wiser than her years and fiercer than her station. The local clergy did what frightened, hopeful people have always done. They named it divine. They moved her into religious life, and they began to listen as though God himself had decided to speak through a poor girl from the countryside. Pilgrims came, at first in trickles and then in streams, shuffling into the quiet priory, where incense clung to the stone and light pooled on worn flagstones. And they watched as Elizabeth, now robed as a nun, stiffened and trembled and slipped into trances, her voice thick and strange as she delivered warnings and promises. And for a time those messages stayed safely spiritual, calling for repentance and humility, urging people to turn their hearts back to God. But power hates a vacuum. And eventually the visions sharpened, turned outward, took aim at the most dangerous subject in England, because Elizabeth began to say that the king's planned marriage to Anne Boleyn stood under divine condemnation, that if Henry took Anne as wife, he would die within a year. And in a kingdom where rumour travelled faster than royal decrees, those words leapt from cloister to church to tavern and woke something raw and furious in the king they targeted. Henry, who had been told since childhood that he was nearly divine, now heard of a nun who claimed that heaven itself opposed him, and that insult did not land like a simple criticism. It landed like blasphemy, turned inside out, as if the universe were rebelling against its own centre. So his gaze began to harden. Festivities at court cooled. Foreign ambassadors noticed that the smiling monarch who once delighted in display now looked often toward doors and shadows, as if waiting for betrayal to step through. And beneath that tightening mask of suspicion, the decision slowly formed that the Maid of Kent could not simply be ignored or gently corrected. She had to be investigated, controlled, broken if necessary, because in a system where the king had made himself the bridge between earth and heaven, any rival voice claiming to speak for God threatened not only his throne, but his very sense of who he was. What followed would drag Elizabeth Barton from that scented cloister to a wooden gallows at Tyburn, would turn a devout young woman into a criminal, and would reveal the darkest face of a reign, remembered mostly for wives and wars. Because the story of how Henry VIII dealt with this nun is not just a footnote in church history. It is a blueprint of how tyrants behave when they are afraid, how they twist faith into a weapon, how they use law as a mask for vengeance, and how they try to erase the very people who dared to tell them that power has limits. And as we move deeper into her fate, you will see why one girl from Kent frightened a king enough that he was willing to risk his soul just to silence her voice. In the months after Elizabeth Barton's warnings first began to escape the stone walls of her priory, the kingdom did not change all at once. It shifted the way an old house shifts in the wind. Tiny groans in the beams, soft cracks in the plaster, sounds that only the anxious truly hear. And in those sounds, Henry VIII started to sense something he hated more than any foreign enemy. The feeling that his subjects might be listening more closely to another voice than to his. In London, messengers on horseback carried official news sealed with wax. But in the markets and churchyards of Kent and Essex, and the distant shires, people traded a different kind of story. One, about a nun who fell into trances and spoke of divine anger. And as those stories drifted upward, through parish priests to local magistrates, to the ears of bishops, they brought with them a question no king ever wants to face. What happens if the people begin to believe that God disagrees with the crown? Henry had been trained for war, for diplomacy, for glittering appearances on great fields of cloth and gold, but nothing in his education had prepared him for the idea of spiritual rebellion, of a challenge that did not come with banners and steel, but with candles and whispered prayers. And when word finally reached him that this Maid of Kent claimed heaven would strike him down for taking Anne Boleyn as his queen, the first reaction was not thunder. It was a cold, quiet listening. The kind of silence that makes courtiers hold their breath and glance at each other's faces without daring to speak. For a king who understood that his new religious settlement was fragile, that nobles and commoners alike still remembered the old obedience to Rome, the idea of a prophetic nun was more than annoying. It was terrifying, because she was everything he could not be. Humble, cloistered, untouched by the obvious hungers of power. And that made her words feel, to many, more trustworthy than his statutes. Around him, the court became an echo chamber of tension, the great halls and painted ceilings bearing witness to a new kind of unease. Feasts that once stretched late into the night began to end earlier. Musicians found their songs falling into awkward hushes. Jokes that might have sparked roaring laughter now died on the tongue when a careless phrase brushed against religion. And ambassadors writing home described a monarch who still smiled, but whose eyes had sharpened, always searching, always measuring who flinched when the subject turned to the nun in Kent. Henry began to ask questions. Not the open ones of a curious ruler, but the pointed, dangerous questions of a man already suspecting betrayal, who has heard that somewhere in his kingdom a small flame has been lit that could, if left alone, grow into a fire beneath his own throne. Into this charged atmosphere stepped Thomas Cromwell more fully, the son of a blacksmith who had clawed his way up through bruised knuckles and quick wits. A man who looked at crises and saw not chaos but opportunity, and where others saw a hysterical nun and a nervous king, he saw a chance to tighten the new order until it squeaked. Cromwell, with his neat handwriting and iron patience, I understood that you do not crush a spiritual symbol with simple insults. You crush it with paper, with records, with interrogations, with a slow rain of small, relentless decisions that turn flesh and blood into a case file. And so he began to build exactly that. He spoke softly to Henry of the dangers posed by unchecked prophecy, of foreign powers who might use the Maid of Kent as a puppet, of enemies at home who would be delighted to chant her visions in the ears of discontented subjects. And in these conversations, of a plan took shape, a net woven out of parchment, and seals that would be cast over Elizabeth Barton and everyone who had ever listened to her. While Cromwell sharpened his quills in London, life at the Priory in Kent still tried to move along the old tracks. Bells for prayer, meals in silence, chores in the gardens and kitchens. Yet beneath the steady rhythm, the sisters and monks felt something off, as if the air had grown thicker, as if each footstep echoed a little too loudly in the cloister walk. Pilgrims continued to arrive, some walking for days to kneel before the nun, whose words were now famous far beyond the county. And among those familiar figures of peasants and respectable merchants, there began to appear new faces. Men who asked a few too many specific questions, who lingered a little too long close to the doors of the chapter house, who seemed less interested in salvation and more interested in exact phrases, names, dates. The Priory did not yet know it, But the eyes of the crown had already entered its walls. At first the approach was gentle, at least on the surface. Letters from bishops requesting clarification. Dignified clerics paying visits that were framed as pastoral concern. And Elizabeth herself, exhausted by the constant trances and the weight of expectation, answered as best she could, still convinced that she was responsible for delivering the warnings she believed God had placed on her tongue. She spoke of her visions, of the figure of a king standing at a crossroads between obedience and ruin, of a realm that would face catastrophe if he chose wrongly. And the men who listened to her scribbled furiously, noting each image, each sentence, their minds already stripping away the trembling human being in front of them and replacing her with a set of charges yet to be written. The more she repeated her certainty that Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn stood under divine judgment, the further she walked along a path whose end she could not yet see. As the inquiries deepened, the mood around Elizabeth slowly shifted, and the subtle change may have hurt more than the open hostility that would follow later, because the same clergy who had once beamed with pride at the holy woman in their midst now began to look at her with a flicker of fear behind their eyes, calculating not whether her visions were true, but whether standing near her might become dangerous. Some of them tried to coax her towards softer language, toward vager warnings, toward language that could be read as symbolic rather than aimed like an arrow at the king. And when she refused, when she insisted that what she saw in her trances was clear and specific, those allies felt the floor tilt beneath their feet. They had thought her prophecies might guide England toward righteousness. But in the new order taking shape, righteousness would be defined by Henry alone. Meanwhile, in the corridors of power, Cromwell and his circle collected every rumour that touched Elizabeth Barton's name, treating gossip as clues and private prayers as evidence, and they began to map her influence the way a general maps enemy positions, marking which monasteries had supported her, which priests had repeated her words, which noble families had taken an interest. The story of a nun's visions had become, in their hands, a potential network of sedition, a web of loyalties that did not point toward the king, and that alone made it intolerable. This was the point at which Henry's personal offence fused with political necessity, and that fusion was deadly, because now suppressing the Maid of Kent was not merely about silencing an insult. It was about proving that no spiritual claim, no matter how earnest, would ever outrank a royal decree in the hearts of English subjects. In the Priory, Elizabeth's body bore the cost of all this invisible pressure, long before the first royal commissioners appeared at the gate. Her spine curved by long nights without rest, her eyes hollowed by the constant expectation that people placed upon her, her hands shaking not only from the chill that crept through the stone, but from the knowledge that every trance now carried consequences far beyond the walls she could see. Yet she did not recant, did not soften, did not turn her visions into harmless metaphors. And perhaps that is what made her so frightening to those who had learned to bend and survive. That stubborn conviction that if heaven had truly spoken, then no earthly power, not even a king who called himself head of the church, you could make her unsay what she had been given to say. When at last the formal inquiry descended in full, when commissioners arrived with parchment stamped and questions carefully prepared, everything that had been unspoken became explicit, and the world Elizabeth knew began to narrow into a series of small, airless rooms where she was no longer treated as a vessel of grace, only as a problem to be solved. Her story, which had once seemed to belong to God and the people, was now being pulled into the grip of a man who could not bear to imagine that heaven might disagree with him. And in those first interrogations, the lines were drawn that would carry her from the scent of incense to the smell of Tyburn's rough timber. Lines written not in thunderbolts but in ink. Allies. and a king's growing terror of losing control. The commissioners who stepped over the threshold of the priory did not look like monsters, and that was the first cruelty, because the sisters had imagined that destruction, if it came, would wear armor and brandish swords, not ink-stained fingers and tidy cloaks. Yet these men carried with them something far sharper than steel. The authority of a king who had decided that doubt was treason and that prophecy, if not controlled, was a crime. They asked to see the records, the letters, the notes of Elizabeth's trances, and the prior, who had once shown those papers proudly as signs that heaven still touched England, now handed them over with hands that would not stop trembling, feeling as if he were placing his own veins on the table. The visitors spoke politely. They listened to the nuns with an air of pitying patience. But every question was a hook, every nod an invitation to say a little more than was safe. And as the hours lengthened into days, the priory's quiet was filled with a new sound, the steady scratch of quills writing down a life as if it were a crime scene. Elizabeth herself was summoned again and again to a small room that smelled of damp plaster and old straw, where she sat across from men who pretended to be curious shepherds of souls, but whose eyes never softened. Men who began their interviews with gentle, almost fatherly tones, asking her to describe her first illness, her earliest visions, the way the trances took her, whether she felt heat or cold, light or darkness, and she, who had spent years trying to be honest about the strange force she believed moved through her, answered as faithfully as she could, describing the weight in her limbs, the sense of being lifted and pressed down at once, the vivid images of kings and altars and storms that had driven her to speak. At first, she believed that telling the truth would protect her, that if those in power understood how helpless she felt in the grip of the visions, they might be moved to fear God more deeply. Yet she began to notice that the scribes at the back of the room never seemed to write down the parts about obedience and humility. They leaned forward instead, when her words touched the king, when they brushed his marriage, his crown, his soul, as if all the rest were just static, and only those dangerous sentences mattered. Outside that room, the community that had formed around her began to fracture under the pressure they had never trained for. The slow torture of uncertainty, because each monk and nun was questioned alone, asked to recount what they had seen and heard, and they quickly realized that the answers did not only affect their own safety, they might condemn their friends. A confessor who had once encouraged Elizabeth to keep a record of her visions now found those very entries cited back at him as proof that he had promoted sedition. A simple brother who had escorted pilgrims to her cell discovered that his kindness could be twisted into evidence of a conspiracy to spread rebellion. And again, the same question came, spoken in different words, but carrying the same poison. Had anyone suggested to the Maid of Kent what to say about the king? Had anyone put thoughts into her mind? Or had anyone used her as a mouthpiece? The hunters were not just interested in her, they were searching for accomplices. And in that search, innocence counted for nothing. Fear has a smell when it settles into stone, a bitter, metallic tang that rides the air more heavily than incense. And soon it hung over the priory, clinging to the prayer stalls and the refectory tables, seeping into the dormitory where sisters lay awake at night, eyes open in the dark, listening for footsteps on the stair that might mean another summons. Another round of questioning. They still rose for the canonical hours, still chanted the psalms, still bowed in the choir, but the words caught in their throats, because they could not stop wondering whether the God they invoked would rescue them, or whether he had handed them over to a king who now claimed to speak in his name. Elizabeth saw it in their faces, in the way some avoided her gaze, not because they hated her, but because looking at her was like staring at lightning, beautiful and deadly, and she felt guilt twist in her gut. Not for the warnings she had delivered, which she still believed had come from heaven, but for the suffering that had come to those who had loved her for them. In London, Cromwell read the reports that flowed in from the commissioners like a physician examining a patient he had already decided to condemn, and he began to piece their fragments into a narrative, trimming away anything that might make Elizabeth appear too innocent or too holy, highlighting every phrase that could be interpreted as an attack on the king, rearranging statements so that spontaneous visions looked like carefully engineered performances. And with each adjustment, the picture shifted from a devout young woman, overwhelmed by trances, into something more politically useful, a tool wielded by ambitious clergy to challenge royal supremacy. He did not need her to be truly guilty. He needed her to be plausible as a threat, dangerous enough to justify the punishment he was already planning. And in this cold arithmetic, the subtleties of conscience, of sincerity, of terror simply did not count. In his hands, ink became a blade sharper than any axe. When the order finally came that Elizabeth was to be brought to London for further examination, the Priory felt the blow like a death knell, though no one said so aloud. The day of her departure was grey and windless, one of those mornings when sound seems to fall flat against the sky, and the sisters gathered silently in the yard to watch as she was led toward the waiting horses, her habit fluttering around legs that had grown unsteady, her hands bound lightly, almost politely, as if someone wanted to pretend this was a pious visit rather than the first stage of a journey that would end beneath a gallows. She turned to look back at the buildings that had defined her world, the chapel where she had knelt, the cloister where pilgrims had touched the hem of her robe, the refectory where she had eaten in silence alongside friends who now stood with their lips pressed tight to keep from crying. And in that moment she felt, with a clarity that almost stole her breath, that whatever awaited her ahead, she could not return to the life she had known, that the road before her was one way. The ride to London was not long by the reckoning of courtiers used to travelling between palaces, but for Elizabeth it felt endless. Each mile, not just a measure of distance, but a peeling away of protection. Because the further she went from the hills and fields of Kent, the more she felt herself entering a world where she was not a miracle but a problem. A world of stone towers and vaulted halls, where decisions were made in candlelight and sealed with wax that might outlast her bones. The men escorting her spoke little, their faces wooden, yet she caught one or two glances that suggested they, too, were uneasy. Not because they doubted the king's right to question her, but because some part of them still believed it unwise to manhandle someone many had called holy, and that small flicker of superstition kept them from cruelty on the road. They gave her water when she stumbled, lifted her gently when she faltered dismounting, and avoided speaking her name, as if naming her might invite her visions into their dreams. As the city walls rose ahead like a jagged line against the sky, thick and weathered by centuries of conflict, Elizabeth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. For she knew that within those walls, Henry's will was something almost physical, a force that reshaped laws and churches and lives. And she wondered, not for the first time, whether the messages she had spoken had been meant only for this king, or also for the people who followed him so blindly. The streets swallowed the little party, the noise of London bursting around them, the cries of vendors, the rumble of carts, the clang of distant hammers. Yet even in that chaos, she sensed a strange quiet around her, a bubble of awareness, because news travelled fast in a city, and some heads turned with recognition. A few women crossing themselves, some men muttering darkly, but most simply staring, curious to see the nun whose words had fluttered through taverns and pews like dangerous birds. They did not take her straight to the tower, that fortress reserved for the final act, but to a place where church and state intertwined, the guarded chambers of Lambeth, where archbishops held councils and where, more and more often in those years, spiritual concerns were filtered through political needs until the two could barely be told apart. Here she was lodged in a small cell with a narrow window that looked not onto open fields but onto a walled courtyard. And here the questioning began again. This time, under the watchful eye of men whose vestments and titles suggested holiness, but whose loyalties lay firmly with the monarch who had made himself their supreme head. The air of this place was different from the priory, the prayers more formal, the corridors wider, but beneath the polish, Elizabeth could sense the same thing she had felt in Kent, that thick undertone of fear, because even those who interrogated her seemed haunted by the knowledge that one wrong sentence might cost them their positions, their freedom, perhaps even their lives. In the long hours between examinations, when footsteps faded and doors stayed shut, she knelt on the bare floor and tried to pray as she once had, reaching for the God who had seemed so close in her trances. Yet now, her mind felt crowded with the voices of her questioners, the way they had pounced on particular phrases, the way they had tried to guide her toward admissions that did not match her memory of what she had seen. She wrestled with the terrifying possibility that she had been used, not by scheming monks, as her accusers suggested, but by a divine will that had led her straight into the path of a king's fury. And in that wrestling there were moments of doubt, flashes of exhaustion, when she wondered whether silence would have been wiser, whether any human should claim to speak for heaven. Still, when dawn came, and she was summoned once more, she found herself unable to betray the core of what she believed. Because even if her visions had been distorted by tellers and repeated by politicians, somewhere at their heart remained a truth she could not shake, that no crown, no matter how heavy, could ever truly make itself God. While she struggled alone with those questions, the men on the other side of the door were engaged in a different kind of struggle, a calculated refining of the story they intended to present to the king and to the realm. And in that world of quills and wax and whispered conferences, her fate was being decided in language she would never hear, in sentences that would strip her of complexity and turn her into a single, simple thing, a warning. In Lambeth's hushed chambers, where the stone corridors had watched centuries of bishops pace and pray, the next phase of Elizabeth Barton's undoing unfolded with a peculiar gentleness that was, in its way, more terrifying than any open brutality, because it came wearing the face of concern. The man who stepped into her cell one morning did not arrive with guards in tow or with a clerk hovering beside him. He came alone, carrying the weight of a title that had never existed before in England's history, Archbishop of Canterbury, in a church whose supreme head was no longer the Pope, but the King himself. Thomas Cranmer was not made of the same metal as Henry or Cromwell. He was softer around the edges, a scholar who preferred books to battles, a man whose doubts often wrestled with his certainties. And when he looked at Elizabeth, he did not see only an enemy of royal supremacy. He saw a soul in crisis, and a looming danger that might yet be turned aside if only someone could persuade her to bend. He spoke to her not as an interrogator, but almost as a confessor, asking about her conscience, about whether she had ever feared that the visions might be misinterpreted, whether she now understood how her warnings against the king's marriage could rip the fragile seams of the new religious order they were trying to sew together. He did not deny that God might speak through humble vessels. He did not mock her trances. And for a moment, Elizabeth felt a jolt of relief, as if at last someone in power was willing to see her as more than a symbol or a threat. Yet, as the conversation went on, she realized that Cranmer's kindness carried its own sharp edge. because every gentle word curled back toward the same request: that she step away from the precipice she had approached, that she declare, for the good of England, that her prophecies had been misunderstood, that the people should place their trust not in her visions, but in the king's anointed authority. He was offering her a way to live, but it was a life built on swallowing the very message she believed heaven had forced her to speak. Elizabeth listened, hands twisted in the fabric of her habit, exhausted eyes following his movements as he walked the small space between wall and bed. And inside her, thoughts battled fiercely, because this man did not look like her enemies from childhood tales of persecution. He looked like every kindly pastor she had ever known. And part of her longed to surrender, to say that yes, she would call it all a mistake, that yes, she would retreat into silence if it would save not only her own life, but the lives of those entangled with hers. Yet whenever she tried to form those words, something in her recoiled, not from pride, but from the memory of those early trances when she had felt, as surely as she felt the cold stone beneath her knees, that a will beyond her own was pressing truth into her mouth. To deny that now felt like more than self-preservation. It felt like betrayal, not of a cause or a faction, but of God. So she did what terrified him most. She held her ground with quiet stubbornness, insisting that what she had said about the king's marriage had not been crafted by monks or planted by malice. It had been given, and whether men believed her or not, she could not unsay it. Cranmer's shoulders seemed to sag under the weight of that refusal, because he knew his realm too well to pretend that Henry would simply shrug and move on. And when he left her cell, slipping back into the corridors with his robes whispering over the floor, there was something like dread in his step, the haunted awareness that the decision now would pass out of his hands and into the grasp of Thomas Cromwell, who did not share his hesitation. If Cranmer represented the last flicker of pastoral concern in Elizabeth's treatment, Cromwell represented the cold, administrative face of power, a man who had no interest in wrestling with her conscience when he could instead rewrite her in ink. Under his direction, the atmosphere around her hardened, small kindnesses evaporating, the questions growing more precise, more repetitive, designed not to uncover truth but to grind her down, to catch her in contradictions, to create the illusion of guilt, even when none existed. She was moved from room to room, called up at hours when her body begged for rest, confronted with fragments of her own words twisted back at her, asked why she had said one thing to a priest and another to a pilgrim, whether she understood how many had been misled by her warnings, whether she now recognized the king's mercy in giving her a chance to recant. The interrogators did not shout. They did not need to, because their power lay not in volume, but in their ability to write the record. And while she sat there, trying to hold on to the clarity of what she had once felt was heaven's touch, they were quietly building a version of Elizabeth Barton that bore little resemblance to the woman in the chair, a version that would show a schemer, a puppet of disloyal clergy, a figure who cloaked political rebellion in pious language. Somewhere between those long, punishing sessions and the drafts that emerged from Cromwell's chambers, the assertion appeared that she had confessed, that she had admitted her visions were false, that she had admitted to deception, and whether those words ever crossed her lips exactly as written, or whether they were crafted in some late-night conference by men smoothing the narrative into a form that would please the king, no one can now say with certainty. What matters is that once that supposed confession existed on paper, it became more real in the eyes of the law than anything she might say afterward, more solid than the memories of those who had known her sincerity, more powerful than her own protests. In that moment, the balance tipped. and the machinery that had been circling her began to move with a new, relentless speed. Letters were dispatched to identify and summon anyone closely associated with her. From learned clerics who had once defended her in theological debates to simple parish priests who had repeated her warnings in sermons. And each of these names became another thread in the web. Cromwell was weaving a web that was not primarily concerned with Elizabeth herself anymore, but with sending a message to the nation about what it meant to challenge the spiritual authority of a king who had made himself head of the church. Inside monasteries and parishes, the news fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of fear through communities already shaken by the dissolution of religious houses and the sudden shifts in doctrine. A friar who had proudly called her a living sign of God's grace now heard he might be summoned to London, not to celebrate miracles, but to answer charges of treason. And he lay awake at night wondering whether he would have the strength to stand by his former words when faced with the same cold questions that had broken others. Parish priests, who had once comforted illiterate villagers with tales of the Maid of Kent's holy trances, now hurried to distance themselves, editing their sermon books, avoiding her name, even suggesting from the pulpit that they had never entirely trusted her. The church, which should have been a refuge for truth, turned in on itself, devouring its own earlier enthusiasm in a desperate attempt to appease the royal will. For Elizabeth, the world shrank further with each passing day, the future no longer a hazy, the distant thing, but a narrow corridor leading toward an end. She could now glimpse. Her body betrayed the strain before her words did. Her face thinned, the bones pressing sharp under the skin, her hair losing its luster, her hands shaking even when she held them tightly in her sleeves. The visions that had once come upon her with overwhelming force grew rarer, not necessarily because God had fallen silent, but because exhaustion had wrapped itself around her like chains. And even when she closed her eyes and tried to surrender to that familiar otherness, she found herself dragged back again and again into the immediate reality of stone walls, barred windows, and voices that did not want prophecy, only submission. In the rare moments when she was left alone, she thought of the people she had met at the priory, of the faces of the sick and desperate who had travelled miles to hear her speak. And she wondered what they were being told now, whether they were hearing that she had lied, or worse, that she had betrayed them. Meanwhile, Henry watched all of this unfolding from the shifting centre of his court, and though he did not sit in on every interrogation or read every deposition, the reports that reached him were shaped to satisfy him, emphasizing her alleged admission, the supposed manipulation by clerics, the danger she had posed to the unity of the realm. For a man who had spent his life being told that his conscience and God's will aligned, it was far easier to accept that a nun had been led astray than to entertain the devastating possibility that heaven might have used her to confront him. The more thoroughly Cromwell framed her as a fraud, the more firmly Henry could push away the sting of her original warning and recast the whole affair as an attack on order rather than a judgment on his choices. In private, he may still have felt a flicker of unease, because terror often clings stubbornly in the corners of a tyrant's mind. But in public, his path was clear, and that path led inevitably toward making an example of Elizabeth Barton so unforgettable that no other voice would dare to rise in similar defiance. By the time the interrogations at Lambeth reached their end, the shape of her destiny had hardened, even if no one yet spoke it aloud in her presence. The nun who had once been wrapped in the language of sanctity had been unwrapped, repackaged, and labelled a traitor in all but formal declaration. And far beyond the walls that contained her, the air in England grew heavy with the knowledge that a line was being drawn, a line between those who would align every part of their faith with the king's decrees and those who still believed that God might stand apart from his throne. Elizabeth's story, which had begun with an illness and a vision in a small country chapel, now belonged to forces far larger than herself. Forces that could no longer be satisfied with questioning or correction. They would demand something final, something public. And as the ink on Cromwell's papers dried, the gallows at Tyburn began, invisibly, to cast its long shadow over her remaining days. In the weeks after the doors at Lambeth closed on Elizabeth Barton's last great interrogation, the storm that had circled so long above her finally broke open and began to roll outward, away from the narrow cell where she prayed, and into the parishes and cloisters of England. And the first places to feel its weight were not the king's great palaces, but the quiet churches where her name had once been spoken in hopeful whispers. Because now those same whispers tasted of danger. Cromwell's messengers rode out with instructions folded carefully under their seals. Orders that did not shout their purpose, but carried it with the steady chill of winter rain. Instructing commissioners to draw up lists of anyone who had supported the Maid of Kent, anyone who had carried her words from town to town, anyone who had dared to treat her as a vessel of grace, rather than as a troublesome woman who had overstepped her place. In rectories where parish priests had once copied her prophecies into private notebooks, those same notebooks were now hurriedly burned. The ink that had once felt like a testimony to God's living voice turning to smoke in hearths where no one spoke as the pages crumbled. And men of the cloth stood staring into the flames, asking themselves whether the sin lay in having believed or in being afraid now. Monks who had argued late into the night about the meaning of her visions found that no one wished to remember those conversations when royal officers appeared, politely asking for any documents, any letters, any mentions of the nun whose name seemed suddenly wrapped in invisible barbs. In some places, confessors folded under the pressure at once, insisting that they had always been skeptical, that they had been misled by rumors, that they had never fully trusted what she said about the king. Their fear of earthly judgment drowning out any lingering reverence for the woman they had once called Holy Sister. Yet not everyone could move so easily into the new story. There were parishioners who could not forget the way her words had pierced them, the way she had spoken of their hidden sorrows, with a clarity that had left them trembling. And when they heard from the pulpit that the Maid of Kent had confessed to fraud, that she had humiliated the faithful and slandered the crown, those listeners sat very still, their hands clenched, feeling something fragile inside them crack. Some kept their questions to themselves, knowing it was safer to let the official story settle over the village like dust. But in a few cottages at the edge of fields, old women and weary men shook their heads and whispered that the powerful always called inconvenient truth a lie, and that saints were often smeared before they were buried. Their skepticism did not reach far, but it flickered in the corners, a quiet refusal to let the royal narrative swallow all memory. Back in London, where power moved in circles, narrower and more vicious than any village lane, Cromwell's office had become a kind of secular sacristy, its shelves no longer holding relics and chalices, but bundles of parchment bound with rough twine, each stack a small altar to the new god of order, each page a fragment of someone's fear. Clerks bent over their desks and copied depositions that blurred into one another. Lines about sedition, disobedience, false prophecy, treason, repeaters of dangerous words, circulate again and again in the ink, until anyone skimming the pages could easily believe that Elizabeth Barton had woven a web of rebellion rather than a path of desperate warnings. Names of monks, friars, town priests, even a few nobles trickled through these documents like beads on a rosary, each fingered in turn, Viii, and assigned a place on the scale between useful example and necessary sacrifice. The goal was never just to destroy one nun. It was to send a signal to every soul in England that the days when visions could challenge a king were over. While this quiet apparatus of ruin worked around her, Elizabeth's world narrowed further, not in some dramatic collapse, but in the small, painful ways that mark the final stage of a life being unmade by others. She no longer heard much of what was happening beyond her walls. Only fragments brought by guards who were less careful with their tongues, or by a sympathetic attendant who still believed, in some aching corner of his heart, that her suffering was wrong. From these scraps, she learned that others had been arrested, that some who had once defended her now preached against her, that people who had never met her spoke of her as if she were a cunning deceiver. And each report fell on her like a stone. She prayed for those who denounced her, not because she felt herself above them, but because she understood, with terrifying clarity, the pressure they were under, the way fear could twist loyalty until friends and enemies traded places. On some nights, when the candles in the corridors had been snuffed, and only the distant murmur of the river threaded through the silence, Elizabeth lay awake and tried to remember the first time she had fallen into a trance. The first time her lips had formed words that felt too large to belong to her, and she wondered whether, if she had simply stayed silent that day, the course of her life would have curved gently toward an ordinary death in an ordinary cell. Her name forgotten, but her bones at peace. Yet no matter how many times she walked that path in her mind, she always came back to the same impasse, the same sense that silence would have been a betrayal of the God she loved, that to have swallowed those warnings would not have saved her soul, only her skin. It was a bitter comfort, but it was all she had, and she clung to it in the same way she had once clung to the wooden edge of the altar during her storms of vision. The decision to move her from Lambeth to the Tower of London did not come with heralds or proclamations. It arrived as a simple instruction, signed and sealed, stating that for the security of the realm she was to be kept under closer guard, and the men tasked with carrying it out treated the order not as a moral question, but as another duty to be completed before nightfall. They came for her at dawn, when a pale wash of light barely outlined the windows, and she knew, the moment they appeared, that something final had shifted, because the tower was not simply a prison. It was a symbol, a place where history itself seemed to lean heavily against the walls, whispering of those who had gone in and never come out alive. As she stepped into the courtyard, the wind knifed around her, and she felt a shiver that was not entirely from the cold, a sense that every stone she passed was watching. The journey across the river was short, a matter of minutes, in an open boat that rocked gently beneath their weight. Yet each stroke of the oars seemed to carry her deeper into a story that no longer belonged to her, only to the king who would use her ending as a warning. The water slapped against the hull with the dull, repetitive sound of a heartbeat, and she kept her eyes on its dark surface, remembering the scriptural images of rivers that divided life from death, wondering whether this crossing counted among them. On the opposite bank, the tower rose with its familiar square turrets and heavy walls, pale against the sky, and to those who watched from a distance, it might have seemed unchanged from the days of earlier kings. But Elizabeth felt the difference. This was not the old fortress of barons and rival princes. This was now part of the machinery of a monarch who had claimed even the soul as his jurisdiction. Within those walls, life moved with a strange, inverted rhythm, quiet where the city outside was loud, intimately concerned with the details of confinement, while the world beyond argued about crowns and creeds. Her new cell was smaller than the one at Lambeth, and colder, its narrow slit of a window, letting in only a slice of light and a knife of wind. Yet even here, not everyone she met was cruel. A few of the guards were rough, eager to mock the fallen holy woman, but others treated her with a shy, uneasy respect, as if some part of them still feared that hurting her would anger a god who might, despite the official proclamations, still be on her side. They brought her food, sometimes sat just outside the door and talked in low voices about their own worries, their families, the rumors of dissolved monasteries and new taxes. And in those moments, Elizabeth felt the strangest intimacy, an almost ordinary human connection within the very structure meant to isolate and terrorize her. Word of her transfer spread quickly through London, carried by servants' gossip and merchants' chatter. And for those who already followed her story, it confirmed what they had dreaded, that the king did not intend to quietly sideline the Maid of Kent. He meant to crush her under the full weight of treason law. Around tavern tables, men close to power murmured that such severity was necessary to preserve order, that allowing prophecies of royal death to go unpunished would invite chaos. While on the edges of the city, in cramped rooms where the poor huddled to escape the wind, others shook their heads and muttered that when a king needed to hang a nun to prove his strength, perhaps that strength was not as unshakable as it appeared. These murmurs did not coalesce into rebellion. They were too scattered and fearful for that. But they formed a kind of invisible chorus surrounding Elizabeth's lonely vigil in the tower, a reminder that she was no longer just a woman. She was a sign people argued over without ever seeing her face. Night after night, she listened to the slow drip of water in the corridor, the distant clang of a gate closing, the footsteps that sometimes paused outside her door and sometimes passed by without stopping. And slowly she came to understand that she was living inside a pause before a blow, a held breath that could not last forever. The legal arguments were still being polished, the charges drafted, the council consulted, but the direction was set, and in that suspended time she did the only thing left to her that felt truly her own. She prayed, not for rescue, which by then she knew was unlikely, but for the souls of those who would condemn her, for the country that had allowed one man's fear to reach so far, and for the nameless people who would hear of her only as a warning and never as a girl who had once fallen trembling at the foot of a statue, believing with all her heart that God had asked her to speak. By the time winter loosened its grip and the first thin hints of spring crept along the river outside the tower, the silence around Elizabeth Barton was no longer empty. It was crowded with decisions made in rooms she would never see. Because while she knelt on the cold floor and traced prayers into the rough stone with her fingertips, the king's counsellors were gathering beneath carved ceilings and heavy tapestries, weighing not whether she should live, but how exactly her death could be turned into a lesson sharp enough to cut through every parish in England. In those meetings, parchment rustled like dry leaves. Men in fine robes spoke in measured tones about treason and sedition, and somewhere behind the careful legal phrases lay a simple, undeniable truth, that a girl from Kent had spoken words which pierced the armour of a monarch who had made himself the head of the church. And the only way to repair that puncture, in their minds, was to hang her where everyone could see and then bury her story in the darkest corner of history. It was Thomas Cromwell who shaped the argument with the precision of a craftsman, gathering the depositions, the alleged confession, the names of priests and monks who had repeated her warnings, and laying them out like pieces on a board until they formed the picture he wanted, not of a lone visionary tormented by her conscience, but of a network of defiance wrapped in a nun's habit, a thread that connected humble cloisters to powerful enemies and foreign sympathizers. Around the council table, some men shifted uneasily, aware that the law they were being asked to invoke had once been designed to punish open-armed rebellion, plots against the king's life, alliances with rival claimants. Yet here it was being stretched to fit the shape of trances and prophecies, of muttered sermons and frightened villagers. Still, they said little, because everyone knew what happened to those who resisted the direction of Henry's will. Parliament would be asked to frame her actions as treason, not because she had raised a sword, but because she had dared to suggest that God might judge the king, and treason, once spoken aloud in such company, had a momentum of its own. While these debates hardened into statutes and articles of indictment, the church's role in her destruction became more naked, because bishops, who had once been the guardians of spiritual life, now found themselves called upon to provide the language that would sanctify what was beneath the robes, a raw act of royal vengeance. Some took to their task with disturbing enthusiasm, crafting sermons that painted Elizabeth as a false prophetess, a woman possessed not by holy inspiration, but by delusion, or even the whisper of demons. And when they preached these words in cathedrals heavy with incense and echo, the congregations listened with a mixture of awe and confusion, hearing the same voices that had once praised her visions, now insisting that to defend her was to endanger one's soul. Others obeyed with less fervour, their words cautious, their eyes dark with a discomfort they dared not name. Yet obedience won out in every pulpit that mattered, because the alternative was to stand on the wrong side of a king who had already proven he did not hesitate to bend the church until it cracked. In the Tower, Elizabeth began to feel the consequences of these decisions in ways both subtle and brutal, because even without being told every detail, she could sense the tightening of the noose. The questions from visiting clerics stopped entirely, replaced by visits from officials whose interest lay not in her conscience, but in her physical condition. Men who checked her pulse and her colour, who looked into her eyes, not with compassion, but with calculation. And when she asked one of them why such concern was being shown for a woman so clearly condemned, his answer came after a long pause, quiet and chilling, that the king did not wish her to die of illness, that she must be strong enough to meet what awaited her. It was a cruel twist, to be tended not for healing, but to ensure she survived long enough to be displayed. But it matched the logic of a regime that now treated her body as part of its theatre, a necessary piece of the spectacle they were building. Outside, London's mood grew heavier, as if the city itself sensed that something more than a single life hung in the balance. Word spread that bills were being prepared in Parliament to condemn the Maid of Kent and her supposed accomplices, that their names would be listed not simply as offenders, but as traitors. Their crimes arranged in careful legal language that spoke of undermining the king's supremacy, of spreading lies designed to weaken the realm. In alehouses where people gathered to drink and mutter in low voices, some shrugged and said that anyone foolish enough to cross Henry deserved whatever came, that these were dangerous times and sensible folk kept their heads down. Others, braver or more broken, recalled how they had once walked to Kent to kneel before Elizabeth, remembered the way her eyes had seemed to see straight through them, the way her voice had trembled when she spoke of judgment, and they found themselves wondering what it said about their country that this tiny, exhausted nun had become the enemy their ruler most urgently needed to crush. Within the church, the betrayal of Elizabeth Barton reached its most painful point when those who had known her best were summoned to publicly recant, to stand in pulpits and declare that they had been deceived, that her trances were nothing but staged illusions, that they regretted ever believing her words came from heaven. Some did this with fanatical energy, perhaps convincing themselves that by denouncing her harder than anyone else, they could wash off the stain of their earlier devotion, shouting from the lectern that she was a liar, a scandal, a danger to souls. Others spoke more softly, their voices tight, their eyes flicking away from the faces that watched them. And although they repeated the required lines, something in their tone hinted at an internal fracture that would never quite heal. Elizabeth did not hear these sermons, but news of them reached her in fragments, and each report felt like another thread snapping, another small death layered on top of the larger one approaching. Still, even as the official narrative closed around her like iron, there remained spaces where that narrative did not fully reach. Little pockets of resistance stored in human memory. In monasteries not yet dissolved, a few scribes hesitated before scraping her name from their records, leaving faint traces of ink where the order had been to leave none, as if some part of them believed that future eyes might one day follow those ghosts of letters and ask what had been erased. In private letters, written by trembling hands and hidden away in chests, priests confessed their unease, admitting that they believed Elizabeth had been sincere, that whatever forces moved her, they had not seemed born of ambition. These thin threads, fragile and easily broken, did not save her, but they would later form part of the trail by which her story would crawl back out of darkness, proving that even in the moment of greatest suppression, the conscience of history was not entirely silenced. Inside her cell, the days blurred into one another, a slow procession of dim light and shadow, of footsteps that came and went, of meals that arrived and disappeared with little taste. And yet, beneath the monotony, a terrible clarity was settling in. Elizabeth no longer fooled herself with hopes of pardon. She could sense, with the sensitivity of the condemned, that the world beyond her door had moved on from questioning to sentencing, that she had become, in the minds of those in power, not a person to be persuaded, but a symbol to be destroyed. There were moments of sharp, piercing fear, especially at night when the walls seemed to press inward, and she imagined the rope, the crowd, the final drop, and in those moments, she shook with a helplessness that no piety could erase. But there were also stretches of stillness, where something like peace seeped in, not because she welcomed death, but because she had accepted that her life had been taken from her long before her body would follow. The moment her visions collided with a king's pride, it was in this strange mixture of terror and resignation that the last pieces of her fate clicked into place. Council signatures drying on parchment, royal assent given with a flourish that probably cost Henry little effort, a bill of attainder ensuring that Elizabeth Barton and those named alongside her could be condemned without the messy uncertainty of a public trial. The law, which should have protected the weak from the strong, had been reshaped into another arm of the king's will. And as the ink dried, the path ahead became brutally simple. A procession through the streets, a gallows at Tyburn, a death meant to speak more loudly than any sermon. Elizabeth could not see that path laid out on the desk where it was conceived, but she felt it as surely as if the boards of her cell floor had begun to tilt toward the scaffold, and in the dim light that filtered through the slit of her window, she folded her hands and whispered prayers, not for deliverance, but for the soul of a country where the fear of one man had grown so vast that it needed to crush even the quiet voice of a praying nun. In the tower's deepening spring, time did not pass in clean days and nights for Elizabeth Barton. It thickened instead into a kind of grey suspension, a world measured less by the sun's climb and more by the rhythms of keys turning and footsteps approaching, by the scraping of a meal dish beneath her door and the occasional creak of hinges that meant someone, for better or worse, was coming in. The bill that condemned her had been signed far from her sight, yet she began to feel its invisible ink in the way guards' eyes changed when they looked at her. In the hushed way, attendants stopped speaking when she asked even the smallest question about what lay ahead. No one told her the full script, but the air around her carried it like a scent, that the waiting was nearly over, that she was no longer being examined. She was being prepared, not for another round of debate, but for display and erasure, for a death meant to shout where she had only ever dared to speak. One morning, she woke to find the air in her cell cleaner than usual, as if someone had bothered to open a door elsewhere and let the river breeze sweep through the corridors. and when the familiar clank of the lock came, the man who entered did not wear the plain harness of a guard or the somber robes of a cleric. He wore the neat, practical garb of a physician, his belt equipped with small vials and folded cloths, his expression studiously neutral. He did not sit. He did not smile. He merely asked her to extend her arm and placed his fingers against the inside of her wrist, counting under his breath, his lips moving in silence as he watched the beat of her life knock faintly against his fingertips. When she asked whether she was ill, he shook his head and said that the council wished to ensure she remained in reasonable health, a phrase that landed between them like a stone. Reasonable health for what? She thought, but she did not need him to answer. She understood now what it meant to be kept alive on purpose, that even her heartbeat had been conscripted into the service of a king who wanted his justice to be seen, not delayed by the untidy interruption of a natural death. After that visit, others followed. Not every day, but often enough to make a pattern. Each physician leaving notes in a hand she was not permitted to read, each glance confirming that her body, though worn thin by confinement, would hold together long enough to walk to the scaffold. The strange tenderness with which they touched her wrists, her forehead, her throat, carried its own cruelty, a parody of care. And in the quiet that followed each examination, she found herself thinking of all the sick peasants who had knelt in front of her at the priory, begging for healing she could not always give. People abandoned by worldly physicians, yet convinced that perhaps a fragment of heaven's power moved through her. How bitterly inverted it seemed now, that she, who had never been able to promise anyone earthly safety, was being kept alive by the finest attention the crown could command. Not for her sake, but for the choreography of her death. In the narrow world of the tower, she was not entirely alone, though the walls tried their best to make it feel that way. Voices sometimes drifted through the stones from other cells, muffled by distance, indistinct, yet undeniably human. And on rare occasions, when a guard's patience wavered or his curiosity overcame his orders, she caught snatches of other people's stories, half-heard tales of a priest who refused the oath of supremacy, of a courtier accused of speaking rashly about the king's latest marriage, of a merchant suspected of hoarding grain while others starved. Their names blurred in her mind, but their fear did not, and there were nights when she lay awake, listening to a restless pacing overhead or the hitching sobs of someone farther down the corridor, and offered up prayers for these unseen neighbours, feeling more kinship with these faceless souls than with the distant bishops who now mouthed the charges against her. Once, perhaps out of some odd mixture of guilt and morbid curiosity, one of the younger guards lingered in her doorway longer than necessary when bringing her food, and when she asked how the city fared, his answer came in a rushed whisper, as if he needed to let the words out before courage failed. He told her that people spoke of her in the streets, that some spat when they said her name and called her a witch who had tried to curse the king, while others crossed themselves and lowered their voices, insisting that she was being martyred for telling the truth, and that no good could come to a country that killed someone for warning of judgment. He shrugged awkwardly when he finished, as if realizing he had said too much, and backed away before she could ask more. But his clumsy report was like a window cracked open a finger's width, letting in a gust of reality, proof that she had not yet been reduced completely to ink and accusation, that beyond the walls there were still hearts wrestling with what her fate meant. Inside the churches, meanwhile, the betrayal of the Maid of Kent continued to unfold as ritual, as performance, as carefully staged self-defense. Services were held in which prayers were offered for the king's safety from false prophets, and the words, though abstract, were understood by everyone present to point directly at her. Clergy, who had once handled her letters with reverent fingers, now handled the new proclamations with the same care, reading out the official account of her supposed deceit, describing how she had been led astray by pride, and how merciful it was that the king had exposed the lie before more souls were ensnared. The congregations listened, some nodding, some staring straight ahead, and a few feeling their stomachs twist at the neatness of the story, at how conveniently it framed the whole ordeal as if the only danger had ever been one misguided nun, rather than the enormous, roaring will of a ruler who could not bear contradiction. Elizabeth did not need to hear these sermons to sense the church pulling away from her completely, like a cloak being yanked off the shoulders of someone left standing in the cold. She had felt the first tug of that separation in Lambeth, when men of God had arrived, with questions sharpened to fit the Crown's agenda. But now, in the Tower, she felt the full weight of abandonment, the understanding that no bishop would risk his own position to plead for her. No formal appeal would be made on her behalf. The institution that had once ushered her into a habit and called her sister had stepped back to save itself, folding into the king's will. And for a while, the pain of that betrayal was so heavy she could barely breathe through it. Yet in the long monotony of the days, another realization settled quietly over that wound, a sense that the God she had tried to serve was not contained by their hierarchy, that the silence of mitred heads did not equal divine approval. If anything, their cowardice underlined the warning she had always tried to voice, that when power and fear clasp hands, faith becomes a costume. She began to speak less with those who entered her cell, not out of defiance, but from a kind of inward turning, a gathering of what remained to her. Words had carried her into this labyrinth, and now words would carry her out, but not in the way the king intended. She started to shape prayers not just for the present, but almost for the future. For readers she could not imagine, for ears that might one day hear about her, not as a cautionary tale of delusion, but as a testimony about the danger of letting one man claim all channels between heaven and earth. It was a strange thought, to pray that her story, which was being so carefully twisted and buried, might nevertheless leave enough traces that someone centuries hence could pull it from the margins and listen differently. Yet it gave her a sense of purpose in the face of a death designed to erase her, a purpose that even a rope and a pit could not quite cancel. On some days the fear still came in, waves that soaked everything, leaving her shivering and gripping the edge of her pallet, imagining the rough touch of the executioner's hands, the weight of the rope against her neck, the moment when the world would snap away. She did not pretend to be beyond that terror. She was no serene statue of sanctity. She was a woman whose body knew it was about to be broken. But those waves were followed, increasingly, by stretches of fierce clarity, where she could look at her own story as if it belonged to someone else and see, with almost painful simplicity, that nothing she had ever wanted had prepared her for this, that she had asked for neither fame nor influence, only for God to be obeyed. The king, by contrast, had spent his entire life chasing the assurance that he could bend reality to his desires. And in that contrast, she found the sharpest edge of the truth she had been punished for speaking, that humility and pride were always going to collide sooner or later. And when pride sat on a throne, humility would often end up in chains. As the days bled into one another, and rumours of a date for her execution swirled just beyond her reach, Elizabeth's prayers took on a new tone, not simply pleading or lamenting, but something like a final offering, a placing of her small, frail existence into the hands of the God she had trusted, even when every earthly structure that claimed to serve him had turned its back. She asked not that her name be cleared in her own time, but that the truth of what had happened, the fear that had driven a king to kill a nun for speaking against his marriage, The Church's willingness to cooperate, the way ordinary people's faith had been co-opted, would not be lost. If history had a conscience, she thought, then perhaps one day it would feel the weight of this injustice pressing against it, refusing to sink. And so, in the Tower's cold heart, while councillors finalised the choreography of her final walk and carpenters checked the soundness of the gallows at Tyburn, the condemned woman did the only thing left that no decree could stop. She laid claim to the one court whose judgment no king could overrule, the quiet, patient court of memory. The day the sentence finally entered the world in words, rather than whispers, Elizabeth did not hear it read aloud in the great chamber where it was first proclaimed, but she felt its echo all the same, because some pronouncements move like thunder, rolling outward from carved ceilings and gilded beams until even the smallest cell in the Tower vibrates with their power. In Parliament, men in fur-lined robes listened as the clerk recited the Bill of Attainder that named the Maid of Kent and those tied to her as traitors, the language smooth and precise, crafted to make it seem almost inevitable that a nun who claimed to speak judgment over the king must be crushed beneath the law. And though some members shifted uneasily at the thought of condemning a woman without the formality of a public trial, their murmurs died quickly beneath the heavy knowledge that to oppose this measure was to question not only Henry's policy, but his very supremacy over the Church he had remade in his own image. When the clerk's voice finally fell silent, the ink that had sealed her fate was no darker than before, yet the weight behind it had changed. What had been a plan whispered in council was now a decision voiced before the realm's supposed representatives, and the path to Tyburn had been cleared of the last legal obstacle. Outside the palace, London breathed in that decision without needing to see the parchment itself, because news in a city spreads not only through proclamations nailed to doors, but through the nervous energy that crackles in markets and lanes, through the way tongues loosen over ale and tighten in church pews. Carters and apprentices heard that the King's Council had deemed the Maid of Kent a traitor, and that she would die for predicting his death. And they repeated the story with the mixture of fascination and horror that greets any fall from grace, especially one so spectacular. Some people laughed it off, muttering that anyone foolish enough to curse a king deserved the rope, while others frowned and stared at the cobblestones as they walked, privately unsettled by the idea that prophecy itself could be prosecuted, that a voice claiming to speak for heaven might be dragged through the streets and silenced at the end of a rope between two thieves and common criminals. In the cramped yards of poorer parishes, mothers pulled their children a little closer when the conversation turned to the execution, sensing that something ugly was gathering behind the spectacle, even if they could not name it. Within the churches, the sentence was clothed in liturgical fabric, delivered in phrases designed to soothe as much as to warn. Clergy read out official notices that described Elizabeth Barton's supposed confession, her alleged lies, her manipulation by wicked men, and they framed her impending death as a necessary cleansing, a bitter medicine that would restore order to a body politic infected by superstition and disobedience. Prayers were offered for the king's protection from false visions and for the safety of a church now guided by his anointed hand, and the faithful were warned that to sympathize with the condemned was to flirt with the same deadly error. To many listening, this narrative slid easily into place. It was comforting to believe that the problem lay in one misguided woman, rather than in the unsettling fact that their ruler seemed to require blood and humiliation in order to feel secure. But there were always a few, scattered through the pews like seeds on hard soil, who felt their stomachs twist when her name was spoken, who remembered stories of her early humility, of the tears that had accompanied her warnings, and who could not quite force their hearts to accept that everything about her had been false. In the Tower, Elizabeth did not need a herald to tell her that the machinery had shifted from deliberation to finality, because the very behavior of those around her changed, hardened at the edges. Guards who had once indulged in awkward small talk now kept their distance, as if afraid that any kindness offered to a woman officially marked as a traitor might reflect back on them. And the few servants who had shown her quiet human tenderness, slipping her an extra crust of bread or pausing to share a scrap of news, grew brusque and efficient, their eyes sliding away from her face. It was as though an invisible ring had been drawn around her, which no one wanted to cross. A circle not of chains or iron, but of fear. And she understood in a fresh, raw way that the power now moving against her did not need to shout to be devastating. It only had to make other people afraid of being seen caring. She sensed, too, that she would not die alone, that the king's lesson would be made sharper by the company he chose for her at Tyburn. Rumours slipped in through cracks in discipline, names spoken in half, whispers, of monks and priests who were to hang beside her, men whose great crime had been to repeat her prophecies or to hesitate when asked to take the oath that declared Henry supreme head of the church. The knowledge brought a strange mixture of sorrow and solidarity. She had agonized over the suffering her visions had brought to others. Yet now, in the approaching shadow of a shared fate, she found in their presence a grim comfort. Proof that the thing being punished was not simply one woman's audacity, but a whole web of consciences that refused to align themselves neatly with royal decree. She prayed for them by name when she could remember the reports clearly, and when memory failed, she prayed for them as a group, a small, doomed congregation gathered under a scaffold instead of a roof. Henry himself remained a distant figure in her mind, more symbol than man by then. Yet in the palaces where he moved, the decision to proceed with her execution was not taken lightly in terms of optics. Even if it was morally effortless for a heart hardened by years of unchecked power. Advisors discussed where the gallows should be erected, which route the cart should take, how many heralds should ride ahead to proclaim her crimes. Because in this theatre of death, every detail mattered, every sight and sound contributing to the message they intended to brand into the city's memory. That the era of questioning the king's conscience was over. Some counselled that she should be confined to a quiet execution within the Tower grounds, minimizing the chance of sympathy from the crowd. But others, Cromwell among them, argued that only a public spectacle at Tyburn, the traditional crossroads of traitors, would suffice. That nothing less than such a display would reassure the anxious court and cower the murmuring parishes. In the end, the harsher counsel won, as it almost always did around a ruler ruled by his own fear. At night, when the city's roar softened to a distant hum and the wind carried the faint tolling of church bells along the river, Elizabeth imagined the path they were tracing outside her walls. She pictured the heavy wooden frame at Tyburn, the ropes coiled like sleeping snakes, the wide space where crowds would gather, and she felt her breath catch at the thought of being dragged through streets she had once walked as an anonymous pilgrim, now transformed into a living warning. She did not know how many would come to watch, whether the faces would be mostly hostile, curious, or quietly grieving, but she understood that the crowd itself was part of the punishment, that to be turned into a spectacle was to be stripped of the last shred of private dignity, and she had to fight again and again, to remember that the gaze of God, which had once felt so close in her trances, did not change simply because a mass of human eyes chose to see her as a villain. In those last days, before a date was fixed and announced, the Tower became, for her, a kind of threshold, a place where all the lies and truths of her life met and wrestled. She revisited every moment that had led her here, not to wallow in regret, but to search for any place where she had knowingly twisted her visions to serve her own pride. And again she came back to the same aching conclusion, that she had been frightened by her own words, had wished desperately to be wrong about the king, but had never set out to deceive. It was a slender defense in the face of the rope, yet it mattered to her more than any legal argument, because it meant that when she walked to Tyburn, she would not be walking as an actress, caught mid-performance, but as a servant whose message had been rejected by the very soul it was meant to save. Outside, preparations continued with the busy zeal of a city getting ready for a grim holiday. Carpenters checked the timbers at Tyburn, making sure they would hold not just one body, but the cluster of figures that would hang together, their fates braided by a political script none of them had written. Heralds rehearsed the words they would cry to the gathered crowd. The charges of sedition, false prophecy, treason against the majesty of the king, and they learned to project their voices over the noise of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of throats. Vendors quietly anticipated brisk business selling ale and pies to those who came to watch, because cruelty and commerce have always found ways to walk side by side. And in cramped houses near the route, families argued about whether to let their children see, some insisting that it was important they understand the power of the king's justice. Others sickened by the thought of small eyes staring at a swaying nun in a stained habit. Elizabeth, cut off from these countless preparations, could only feel their approach, like a pressure in the air, a tightening that made even the smallest sounds in the corridor seem loaded with meaning. Each time footsteps halted outside her door, her heart jolted, expecting the announcement that the day had been chosen, that the waiting was over. And when the steps moved on, she sagged with a relief, so fierce it almost felt like guilt, because each reprieve brought with it another stretch of dread to endure. Yet in that stretching, in that repeated brushing against the close, blank wall of death without actually touching it, something in her spirit was being tempered, like metal held again and again to the heat, each pass bringing it closer to the form it was meant to take. She did not know what words would come to her when the time arrived, whether she would manage to speak anything at all beyond a choked prayer, but she began to trust that whatever broke from her lips on the scaffold would not be crafted by fear alone. That the God who had once wrestled her into speech in a quiet Kentish chapel might still meet her in the roar of a London crowd, even if no one else there wished to listen. The morning they finally came for her did not look, at first glance, much different from all the mornings that had preceded it. The same weak light scraping its way through the slit of window, the same ache in her joints as she rose from the thin pallet, the same chill that gathered in the corners of the cell like a second shadow. Yet even before the key turned in the lock, Elizabeth felt something new in the air, a strange stillness, as if the tower itself were holding its breath. The footsteps that approached were not hurried, not clumsy. They carried the measured rhythm of men who have practiced their task already in their minds. And when the door opened, she saw, framed in its narrow mouth, not the familiar rotation of guards, but a small knot of figures, one in the dark robes of an official, another in the sober clothing of a chaplain, and behind them 2 soldiers with faces set into the blank expression of those determined not to feel too much. The official read the words in a level tone, informing her that by the will of the king and the judgment of his council, she was to suffer death that day at Tyburn for treason against the crown, for false prophecy, for seditious speech, and as the charges spilled out in smooth, practiced phrases, she listened with a strange clarity, noticing how none of them mentioned the private terror that had driven her to speak in the first place. How the law had found no language for the moment when conscience and power had collided. They allowed her a small time to compose herself, which in practice meant only that they stood aside as she knelt once more on the cold floor and bowed her head, hands clasped so tightly that her fingers ached, And in that brief pocket of silence, she offered up the simplest prayer she had said in her entire life. Not for rescue, not even for courage, but that in the noise to come, she might still belong, in some hidden way, to the God she had tried to serve. That the truth she believed she had spoken would not be entirely drowned by the shouts of heralds and the roar of the crowd. When she rose, her legs trembled but did not fail, and she accepted the cords they tied around her wrists with a small nod, as if consenting to the last line of a story whose earlier chapters had been written in a language she could no longer change. They led her through corridors she had never walked before, passages that wound deeper into the tower's body and then up toward the world. And as they passed narrow slit windows, she caught quick, fleeting glimpses of sky, of the river's dull gleam, of a city that went on living even as it prepared to watch her die. At the river's edge, the boat awaited, low and wide, its boards worn smooth by years of ferrying prisoners whose names had already sunk beneath the surface of history. And she stepped into it with the help of a soldier whose fingers, for just an instant, tightened around her arm in a grip that felt almost human. As they pushed off, the tower's looming walls slid slowly backward, replaced by the jumble of houses and wharves that crowded the banks. And the water, dark and restless, slapped against the hull with its steady, indifferent rhythm. London rose around them, a living thing of smoke and sound, and as the boat moved under bridges, crowded with onlookers, she felt eyes on her from above, a scatter of faces peering down, some curious, some jeering, some quickly crossing themselves before turning away. The wind carried snatches of words to her, fragments of gossip about the nun who had cursed the king, about the holy woman turned traitor. And in those jagged syllables, she heard how her life had been remade before she had even left her cell. How the story people told about her now belonged less to fact than to fear. Once ashore, they did not hurry her through empty streets. They followed a route chosen precisely because it was not empty, winding through Cheapside and other busy thoroughfares where merchants hawked their goods and apprentices ran errands and gossip could travel faster than any official proclamation. She was placed on a simple cart, the boards rough under her feet, and as the horse was urged forward, she rose above the crowd just enough to become a moving landmark, a focus for hundreds of eyes. Around her, heralds rode with trumpets and banners, proclaiming in ringing voices that Elizabeth Barton, late Nun of Kent, and certain monks and priests named alongside her, were to suffer for treason against their most gracious sovereign. And the list of her supposed crimes poured out again. This time, not in the hushed confines of a council chamber, but in the open air, bouncing off shop fronts and hanging signs, sinking into the ears of bakers and barbers and beggars. Some spectators jeered, hurling words like stones, calling her deceiver, witch, liar, while others stood in watchful silence, their expressions shuttered, and every so often she caught the glimmer of a hand raised furtively in blessing, a quick bow of the head, small acts of defiance that might cost nothing, or might, in these dangerous days, cost everything. As the cart creaked along, Elizabeth let her gaze drift above the press of faces to the sky, which that day was a washed, indifferent grey, clouds hanging low, as if the heavens had drawn in close to watch. She thought of the fields and hedgerows of Kent, of the quiet path to the priory that pilgrims had once walked, of the dim chapel where her first terrible trances had knocked her flat before the altar, and it struck her with a sudden, piercing sorrow how far she had travelled from that place, not only in miles but in the shape of her existence. Then, unbidden, another thought rose, quieter but sharper still. The memory of those early visions when she had seen, in flashes, she barely understood, the image of a king standing before a chasm, one path leading toward repentance, the other toward ruin. And she realized that in a way, this procession was only the visible shadow of a choice already made, that her death was less a fresh crime than the final outward mark of a decision Henry had taken long ago. When he had chosen to make his own will, the measure of heaven, the road to Tyburn seemed both endless and far too short. Time stretching and collapsing in strange loops as familiar streets gave way to sparser ground, to the open space where the gallows rose against the sky. The structure itself was brutally simple, a great wooden frame, darkened by weather and by use. And as the cart drew nearer, Elizabeth saw that she would not stand there alone. Other figures were already being positioned beneath its beams. Monks in faded habits, priests in plain gowns, all wearing the unmistakable pallor of those who have looked death in the face for longer than is bearable. Their eyes met hers briefly, and in that exchanged glance, there was no need for words, only the recognition of shared fate, of lives that had diverged in countless ways, but now converged in this single, brutal point. The crowd fanned out around the scaffold in a wide ring, a sea of faces flickering between anticipation and unease. And somewhere among them, perhaps, were those who had once knelt at her feet, now forced to watch her swing for the comfort of a king. They allowed her, as was custom, a final opportunity to speak, and for a moment the restless murmur of the crowd ebbed, pulling back like a tide, leaving a sudden hush into which her voice could fall. She stood as straight as her trembling legs would allow, the ropes visible now at the edge of her vision, and she looked not at the gallows, not at the officials waiting with set faces, but out over the heads of the people who had gathered, over the city whose stones had watched this entire tragedy unfold. The words that came were not rehearsed. They rose from the same place in her that had once coughed up terrifying images in a small chapel. But this time they were gentler, stripped of all but their core. She spoke briefly of her own unworthiness, of her fear that she had been, in many ways, a flawed vessel, and she asked God to forgive her if she had erred in speaking beyond what had truly been given. Yet she did not retract the heart of her warning, not even now. Instead, she turned her voice toward mercy, praying aloud that heaven would have pity on England, that the king's heart might yet be softened, that the blood spilled that day would not stain the realm forever. She did not curse. She did not call for vengeance. And for a heartbeat after she finished, the silence that followed felt almost reverent, as if some small portion of the crowd had been unexpectedly cracked open. Then the heralds moved in to overwrite her final testament, crying once more that she had confessed to fraud, that she had been a tool of seditious clergy, that her every word must be rejected as poison. And the clamour rose again, drowning whatever fragile echo her prayer might have left behind. The executioners stepped forward with practiced efficiency, guiding her to the place beneath the beam, fitting the coarse rope around her neck, their movements brisk, but not cruel, as if they had learned over years of such work that lingering tenderness made their task harder. She closed her eyes as they adjusted the knot, and in that last dark she felt again, not the roar of the crowd or the creak of wood, but the quiet weight of her earliest visions, the sense of a presence larger than any king, the same presence that had drawn her from anonymity into this unbearable light. She whispered one final plea, that whatever judgment might fall on Henry and his counsellors, it would be tempered by the knowledge of their fear, that God would see through the armour of their power to the trembling hearts beneath. When the signal was given and the cart lurched away, she felt an instant of shocking, searing pressure, a white flare of pain that blotted out everything, followed by a numbness that rushed in so quickly it was almost like being unmoored from her own body. The crowd gasped as her form jerked and then sagged, the habit twisting around her legs, and for a few long moments there was only the spectacle of it, the visible satisfaction of a state that had demanded a life and now had it dangling before them. Around here, the other condemned men swung, their bodies turning slowly in the air, and the scene at Tyburn became one more entry in the city's ledger of deaths, another memory to be recounted in taverns and parlours, each retelling, sanding a little more humanity off the figures at the centre, until they became cautionary tales rather than people. When it was done, when the bodies had hung long enough to satisfy the grim measure of the law, they were cut down with no ceremony, their limbs heavy and awkward, their faces already losing the expressions that had once made them distinct. Elizabeth's corpse was denied the tenderness of family hands, denied the solace of a marked grave. She and her companions were buried without rite, without monuments, in ground, chosen not for sanctity, but for convenience. And orders went out that no pilgrim should seek her resting place, that no shrine should rise to mark the spot. In the days that followed, scribes were instructed to remove her name from certain records, to scratch out references that now seemed inconvenient, and preachers were urged to mention her only as an example of deception, a warning against those who would place their own visions above the will of their sovereign. By every outward measure, Henry had succeeded. The voice that had once dared to tell him he was wrong had been strangled into silence, her body consigned to obscurity, her story drowned in a flood of official words. Yet even as the dirt settled over her unmarked grave and the city's life resumed its usual rhythm, there remained stubborn, invisible traces of her that no rope and no decree could quite erase. Threads of memory woven into the thoughts of those who had seen her that day, into the quiet disquiet of parishioners listening to sermons that no longer entirely convinced them, into the unease of clerks and bishops who found that, late at night, when the candles burned low, they could not help but wonder whether they had watched a warning from heaven swing at Tyburn and called it justice. In that unease, in that refusal of the inner heart to fully align with the story power had written, something of Elizabeth Barton endured, waiting in the dark corners of history for the moment when, centuries later, curious hands would open, forgotten chests, smooth out brittle pages, and listen again for the echo of a nun's voice that had once terrified a king. For a long time after the earth closed over Elizabeth Barton's body, the world behaved exactly as Henry VIII and his counsellors had hoped it would, which is to say it hurried on, trampling the freshly dug soil beneath the march of other dramas, other scandals, other deaths that seemed, on the surface, more important. Chroniclers inked their pages with the great events of the age, the break with Rome, the dazzling rise and gruesome fall of Anne Boleyn, the procession of the king's 6 wives across the stage of his temper, and in those accounts the Maid of Kent was reduced to a brief, convenient aside, a foolish nun misled by ambition, a false prophet, briefly troubling the peace of the realm before being swept aside by royal justice. In parish histories and official records, her name thinned like fading ink left in a damp room, until in many places it disappeared entirely, rubbed out or written over, and for most who walked the streets of London in the decades after her death, Tyburn was just Tyburn again, a place where other bodies swung, and her story blurred into the general memory of fear. Yet history, which often pretends to have no conscience, does not forget as cleanly as kings would like. And even in those first generations after her hanging, there were small, stubborn pockets of remembrance that refused to flatten her into the caricature preached from pulpits. an old monk, exiled from his dissolved monastery, would mutter in a corner of an inn that he had once seen a girl fall into a trance and speak words that shook him to the marrow, and no number of royal proclamations could make him believe she had only played at holiness. A frightened parish priest, writing in the margin of his prayer book by the light of a single candle, would note that he had been made to preach against the Maid of Kent, but could not escape the feeling that they had killed her to quiet their own hearts. These whispers, these buried lines, did not form a movement. They did not stop the machinery grinding over her reputation, but they remained like seeds pressed into hard ground, waiting for a different weather. As the centuries turned, other storms claimed England's attention. Civil wars, new dynastias, revolutions of thought and industry, and Henry VIII himself shrank from terrifying presence into a figure on a tapestry, into a name in children's rhymes about doomed queens. Scholars argued over his policies. Tourists stared at his portraits. And in this long recasting of the past, Elizabeth Barton slipped further into the margins. Her story mentioned rarely, if at all. But margins have a peculiar power, because what is placed there is not necessarily lost. It simply waits at the edge of sight. And it was there, in the dust and quiet of archives, that her voice began, slowly, to rise again. In the 19th century, long after the gallows at Tyburn had vanished, and the tower had become a curiosity rather than a threat, antiquarians with more patience than sense began to pry open old chests and shuffle through bundles of parchment no one had touched for generations. And in that crackle of brittle pages, they stumbled upon something unexpected: depositions and letters bearing her name, written in cramped 16th century hands that still seemed to tremble with what they had witnessed. They found fragments of Thomas Cromwell's interrogations, lists of questions and answers, accounts of relentless examinations, of confessions recorded under pressure, and in those cramped lines, the official story of a neat, willing admission began to look less certain. There were gaps where lines had been struck through, spaces where sentences broke off abruptly, as if something too dangerous had once stood there and been scraped away. And there were letters from minor clergy, written in agonized Latin and plain English, confessing to sleepless nights and gnawing doubts about the justice done to a woman they had believed sincere. One document spoke not of an ambitious schemer, but of a young woman overwhelmed by visions she did not understand. Another recorded that some of her companions had retracted their support only after days of confinement and threats. And taken together, these pieces formed a picture much less flattering to the crown than the polished narratives of earlier historians. The men who read these papers in the year 1866 and after were far from saints themselves. They were creatures of their own time, with their own prejudices and blind spots. Yet many of them had grown up in an age that questioned old certainties, that dissected power with a new, colder curiosity. And they were not content simply to repeat the comfortable Tudor line about a holy maid exposed as a fraud. They began to write essays and books that treated Elizabeth Barton not as a punchline, but as a serious figure at the intersection of faith and politics. A woman whose sincerity seemed, in many testimonies, undeniable, and whose real crime appeared to be that she had terrified a king who could not bear to imagine that God might speak against him. They did not canonize her exactly, but they shifted the lens through which she was seen, softening the edges of cartoon villainy and restoring to her at least some measure of humanity, some sense of the cost she had paid for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, with the wrong words blazing in her throat. Gradually, her name returned to the pages of history in a different tone, not as a simple cautionary tale about false visions, but as a case study in how spiritual authority and political power can collide with catastrophic results Writers pointed out that Henry's harshness toward the Maid of Kent revealed as much about his own dread as it did about her trances. That his decision to prosecute prophecy as treason signaled the birth of a new kind of tyranny, one in which the state claimed not just the body and the purse, but the conscience itself. They traced the way the church had bent under that pressure, how bishops and priests had allowed their fear of the king to outweigh their duty to discernment. And they held up Elizabeth's fate as a mirror in which later ages could examine their own compromises, their own willingness to let inconvenient voices be silenced in the name of stability. Meanwhile, in the physical world she had once inhabited, the traces of her presence remained faint, but real. In the archives at Canterbury and Lambeth, her name could be found in the pale ink of registries, barely legible on crumbling paper, fragile as the wings of a dead moth, and yet still there. In Kent, where the priory that had sheltered her was long gone, the land held its memory in quieter ways. In local legends, about a nun who had spoken too boldly, in place names whose origins most had forgotten, but which still carried, like a lingering scent, the outline of her story. No shrine rose to her. No official feast day marked her passing. Yet people standing in those fields on cold mornings could sometimes feel, without knowing why, that the ground beneath their feet had once absorbed tears and fear and courage in equal measure. As modern readers and listeners learned of her, often through the work of historians who had dug her back out of footnotes, they found in Elizabeth Barton's life an unsettling familiarity, a pattern that echoed across centuries. They recognized the way power reacts to being questioned, the way institutions close ranks around their own survival, the way a single, fragile voice can be recast as a dangerous threat simply because it speaks a truth that cuts too close to the bone. In an age that prided itself on free speech, they saw how quickly certain kinds of speech were still labeled unacceptable, how easily whistleblowers and prophets, in whatever form they appeared, could be smeared, discredited, destroyed. And they realized that the distance between a Tudor scaffold and a modern smear campaign was not as vast as the passing years might suggest. In that sense, the Maid of Kent's legacy became less about the specific details of her prophecies and more about the question she posed simply by existing, a question every age must answer for itself, which is whether it will allow any space at all for conscience to stand apart from power. Henry VIII answered that question with a rope and a gallows, with laws that made his own conscience the only one that mattered. And for a time it seemed he had won, because the voices that might have contradicted him were mangled or muted. But the fact that we can speak her name now, that we can trace the lines of her story beyond the version he approved, is itself a quiet refutation of his certainty. He could command obedience in his lifetime. He could command silence in his records. Yet he could not, in the end, command memory to obey him forever. So when we think of Elizabeth Barton today, it is not only as a sad figure swinging at Tyburn beneath a grey London sky, though that image remains burned into the imagination of anyone who has walked her path in thought. It is also as a reminder that the past is full of voices that were smothered and yet continue to whisper through the cracks of official narratives, voices that insist on being heard even centuries after the earth has closed over their bones. The nun who once knelt trembling in a Kentish cloister, the young woman whose words made a king tremble in his private chambers, the condemned traitor whose final prayer was for mercy on England, all these selves coalesce into a single enduring presence at the edge of our historical vision, asking us quietly, relentlessly, what we will do when our own rulers, our own institutions, demand that we call injustice, peace, and fear it, righteousness. In that question lies the true, unsettling heart of her story, a heart that beats on long after the rope has snapped her breath. Because as long as there are people willing to read beyond the proclamations, to listen for the faint, stubborn echoes in the margins. The Maid of Kent has not entirely been silenced. King's laws change, gallows rot, but the conscience of history, however slow, keeps taking testimony. And in that patient court, where power does not get the last word simply because it shouted the loudest, Elizabeth Barton still stands, tired and small and unwavering, holding out the uncomfortable truth that no earthly throne, however high, can finally dictate what is right in the sight of God.